The listing found me on a Tuesday night in Hutchinson, Kansas. While I sat at the kitchen table with my mother's memory care invoice open on my laptop, staring at a monthly total that never once shrank, no matter how many extra shifts I'd begged the plant foreman to give me. I had been laid off from the case parts plant 14 weeks earlier, the third round of cuts in 2 years, finally reaching a man who had run the same stamping line for almost 11 years without ever once missing a shift or asking for a favor from anyone above him. The care facility in Newton billed $4,200 a month for my mother's room, and I was already 3 payments behind on it, the administrator's calls coming now most afternoons at almost the exact same patient, clipped hour every single time. My truck loan alone ran $460 a month, and a credit card I had opened the previous winter to cover the facility's deposit already carried $9,300 in balance, climbing higher every cycle under interest that felt less like a fee and more like a slow bleed I could not find any way to stop. My sister Renata had offered more than once to help cover part of it from Selena, but she had 3 kids of her own and a husband whose overtime had dried up that same spring, and I was not about to let her debt become mine twice over on top of everything else. The posting itself sat near the bottom of a Kansas agricultural classifieds board I had wandered into looking for any kind of seasonal farmhand work at all. A single paragraph titled, "Caretaker Wanted, Working Century Farm, Western Kansas," posted by someone signing only as property management for the Halloran Family Trust. It described a 640-acre wheat and milo operation called Prairie Rest, sitting outside a small unincorporated place called Averill in Gove County. A name I had never once heard before that night, despite having driven through most of that part of the state for parts deliveries during my years at the plant. The pay line stopped me the same way it probably stopped every other tired man who scrolled past it that same week. $56,000 for a 7-month growing season contract, running from the last week of March clean through the 3rd week of October. Half was paid at signing, and the other half paid only on successful completion of the full term. A structure that read to me at the time as ordinary caution on a trust's part rather than anything worth losing sleep over that night. I wrote back within the hour, keeping the message short and practical the way I would with any job that actually mattered to me, and a reply came back before I had even closed my mother's invoice back down on the laptop screen in front of me. The woman signed her message, Marjorie Voss, property manager for the Halloran Family Trust, and her tone carried the same brisk, unbothered confidence I associated with people who manage land and money for a living, rather than people who worked with their hands the way I always had before that plant closed on me. She asked only a handful of practical questions: whether I had any experience with livestock and irrigation equipment, whether I could keep a reliable schedule without much outside supervision, and whether long stretches of solitude would give me any real trouble across a full growing season out there alone. I told her the truth on every count, that I had grown up helping my uncle work cattle and wheat ground outside Great Bend every summer of my childhood, and that I could run and repair most standard farm equipment without needing anyone standing over my shoulder. I also told her that solitude sounded honestly appealing to me for a while that spring, given everything the last year had already taken away from me, and for my own sense of where my life was actually headed. She called the following afternoon, and her voice on the phone matched her writing closely enough that I pictured her almost exactly as she turned out to look the one time we finally stood face to face weeks later on that same property. Marjorie explained the position in more detail over that first call, describing Prairie Rest as a century farm the Halloran family had worked continuously since 1878, though the family itself now lived mostly in Wichita and Denver. The family leased the actual growing operation out to a neighboring farmer each season through the trust's own arrangement, keeping only the caretaker role reserved entirely for someone willing to live out there alone. The trust needed someone living on site through the full growing season to keep the buildings maintained, the equipment serviceable, and to perform what she called a short daily maintenance routine tied to a covenant left over from the property's earliest working days back in the 1800s. The routine itself, once she finally read it out to me in full over that same crackling call, sounded almost quaint compared to the money attached to it. And I remember thinking that I had stumbled onto the easiest $56,000 a man in my position could ever hope to earn in a single season of honest, ordinary work. I would need to ring an old cast iron bell mounted on a post beside the equipment shed, exactly 40 times every single morning before the first real light of dawn reached the eastern fence line of the home quarter section. I would need to walk what the family had always called the long row, a worn path tracing the boundary of that same home quarter, checking 11 fieldstones set into the ground generations earlier for any sign of disturbance. Every single evening, right as the light began to fail behind the windbreak trees to the west. And every night without fail, I would need to keep a single kerosene lamp burning in the farmhouse attic window that faced north toward an old dry well house standing alone at the center of a fallow field. The family had simply never bothered to plant again after some incident decades earlier. Nobody had ever fully explained to her either. Marjorie called it an old agricultural covenant left over from the farm's earliest and hardest years, something the original family had apparently insisted on for generations, and the trust had simply never found any good legal reason to formally discontinue given how little it cost to maintain each season. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought near the end of that same call, that I would also need to leave a small offering of fresh milk and bread at the threshold of the well house before sunrise each morning. It was, she explained, a holdover ritual tied to an old family superstition the trust's own attorneys had apparently never managed to fully talk the Hallorans out of removing from the covenant paperwork. I asked her why a working grain farm with no ongoing dependence on that well still needed a ritual this involved, and she told me only that old lands sometimes carried old habits. Nobody living today fully understood the original reasoning behind any more, not even the family who still insisted on keeping them. It struck me as a strange answer even then, though $9,300 in credit card debt has a way of making a tired man accept a strange answer far more easily than he probably should under better circumstances, and I let the question drop without pushing much further that same evening. I signed the contract 2 days later, a document running nearly 16 pages thick with clauses about liability and confidentiality, and something the paperwork itself simply called the standing agreement, capitalized every single time it appeared anywhere in that same dense text. I drove west out of Hutchinson on the last Sunday of March, my truck loaded with work clothes, a box of my late father's old tools, and a folder of Marjorie's typed instructions I had already read through more times than I could easily count by the time I finally crossed into Gove County that same gray afternoon. The drive into Averill took me north through Wakini and then west along a county road that grew straighter and emptier with every passing mile, the scattered farmsteads thinning out gradually as the land opened up around me. It had become, over the last hour of driving, the kind of flat, wind-scoured wheat country that makes a man feel smaller the longer he sits there watching it roll past his own windshield in total silence. Everill turned out to be smaller even than I had pictured from Marjorie's description, little more than a grain elevator, a shuttered gas station, and a handful of houses that together made up the entire visible remainder of what had once clearly been a real town before the highway moved away from it decades earlier. I met Marjorie Voss in person at the elevator exactly as we had arranged over the phone. A compact woman in her 60s wearing a canvas coat that looked more expensive than anything else in that lot, standing beside a newer four-wheel drive truck with the engine already running against the wind. She shook my hand firmly and studied me for a moment with an expression I read at the time as simple, professional appraisal, though I would come to recognize it much later as something closer to quiet, practiced guilt standing there in that gravel lot outside Averill. We drove the final 7 miles out to the farm together in her truck, the road narrowing to a section line before finally giving way to a long gravel lane that ran straight between 2 windbreak rows of cedar planted, she told me, sometime back in the 1930s to hold the topsoil against the wind. Prairie Rest itself consisted of a 2-story farmhouse, a large equipment shed, a small cattle barn holding a handful of animals. The trust kept mostly for the neighboring lease farmers' convenience, and the old well house standing alone out past the home quarters' northern fence line, inside a field left permanently fallow. She walked me through the standing agreement in careful, deliberate detail that first afternoon, showing me the bell post by the equipment shed, the 11 fieldstones marking the long row, and the well house itself, a squat stone structure with a heavy wooden door that looked considerably newer than the stonework surrounding it. She was oddly specific about the bell, telling me twice that it needed exactly 40 strikes each morning, no more and no fewer, and that a partial or hurried ringing would count in the ledger as no ringing at all according to the covenant's own strict original language. She told me that if the lamp in the attic window ever went dark for any reason during the night, I should relight it as quickly as I possibly could and note the exact length of time it had gone out in the ledger, along with anything unusual I noticed that particular night. It struck me as excessive for what she kept insisting was only an old family superstition, but I filed the instruction away without much argument, eager to finish the tour before the wind picked up harder across that exposed quarter section late that same afternoon. She left me that evening with a stocked pantry, a working cell signal booster mounted on the farmhouse roof, and a laminated card explaining how to start and service the small fleet of equipment parked inside the shed for the season ahead of me. By the time her taillights finally vanished back down that long gravel lane, I stood alone on the porch in a silence more complete than anything I had known in years. The kind of flat, wind-scoured quiet that makes a person suddenly aware of his own breathing in a way ordinary town life rarely ever demands of him. I told myself that first night, lying in the narrow bed upstairs and listening to the wind move steadily across the open wheat ground outside, that $56,000 was $56,000, no matter how strange the fine print had sounded. Standing in that fallow field earlier that same afternoon, the first 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful once my body adjusted to the early hours and the constant wind. The kind of structured solitude I had not realized I was craving until it was finally laid out in front of me every single day of that stretch. I woke well before dawn to ring the bell its full 40 strikes and leave the milk and bread at the well house threshold, walk the long row each evening as the light began to fail behind the windbreak. I logged each observation in the farmhouse ledger with the same careful precision I had once brought to setting tolerances on a stamping die down to 1/1000th of an inch back at that plant in Hutchinson. I lit the attic lamp every night the moment full dark settled over the quarter section, watching the small flame steady behind the old glass before heading back down to whatever supper I had managed to scrape together in that quiet farmhouse kitchen each evening. I noted in the ledger each night that nothing unusual had occurred out there, because for those first 2 peaceful weeks on that quiet, open ground, nothing truly had happened to me at all yet that spring. I drove into Wakini once during that stretch for a few supplies the pantry was running low on, and the man who ran the hardware and feed store there, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s named Delbert Aiken, had apparently run the place since before I was even born. He filled my order without much conversation beyond a passing comment about the dry spring that year, the kind of small talk that passes for friendliness in a town that quiet and that small out on the plains. He asked almost idly where exactly I was staying for the season, and I noticed his expression shift the instant I mentioned Prairie Rest by name. A small flicker across his face that might have been surprise or might have been something closer to pity settling in for just a moment before he caught himself. I asked him what that look meant, and he waved the question off with a short laugh that did not quite reach his eyes, telling me only that the Halloran place went through caretakers about as fast as some of the custom cutting crews used to go through green hands fresh off the bus each harvest season. He told me I should not read too much into small-town talk about a farm most people in Averill had mostly stopped thinking about years ago, and it was an answer that satisfied me well enough that afternoon, mostly because I badly wanted it to be true after everything that job's money already meant for me and my mother back in Newton. I drove back out to the farm that same afternoon with a truck bed full of supplies and a bag of grass seed for the yard around the house, and I did not think much more about his reaction to that name for the rest of the drive. It was not until the small wrongness finally started, slow at first, that I understood the kind of thing a person can talk himself out of for a week or two before the explanations simply stop holding together at all out there. The stalks appeared first, sometime in the middle of that third week. A section of young wheat near the northern edge of the home quarter bent flat into a tight, spiraling pattern that no wind I had ever seen move across open ground could have plausibly produced in a single overnight stretch. They swept inward toward a single point rather than lying flat in one consistent direction the way ordinary wind damage always did on every other field I had ever walked through with my uncle as a boy back near Great Bend. What unsettled me more than the pattern itself was a faint smell hanging low over that section when I finally crouched down to study it closely. Something mineral and slightly sweet that reminded me, uncomfortably, of standing water gone stagnant, far too long inside an enclosed space somewhere nearby. I photographed the pattern on my phone and logged the observation in the ledger exactly as the standing agreement required, describing it only as possible. Wind shear. Even though I did not fully believe that phrase myself, as I wrote it down in my own increasingly uncertain hand that evening. 2 nights later, I woke somewhere near 3 in the morning to a sound drifting across the yard that I placed immediately as one of the cattle bawling, low and steady in a way that did not match the calm, contented animals I had grown used to, feeding every morning since I first arrived out there in March. I pulled on my boots and coat and stepped out into a wind so cold it burned going down, scanning the barn lot for any sign of trouble and finding all 4 animals standing pressed together in the far corner, perfectly still and silent. Every single one of them stood facing north toward the well house instead, rather than settling anywhere near the feed I had put out fresh for them earlier that same evening before the light finally failed. It struck me as strange enough that I logged it too, describing the cattle's behavior as clinically as I could manage for a man standing outside at 3 in the morning in his socks, unable to explain to myself exactly what had spooked them that badly out there. The knocking started the following week, a low rhythmic sound against the kitchen window some nights while I sat inside doing the ledger. 3 slow strikes followed by a long pause, and then 3 more in exactly that same patient, deliberate pattern each time it occurred that whole stretch. I told myself it was a loose shutter or a branch working against the glass in the wind, and for a while that explanation held together well enough to let me keep sleeping through most nights without too much trouble finding rest out there alone. By the middle of April, the small wrongness had piled up into something I could no longer file away as an overtired mind playing tricks on itself out in that much isolation for the very first time in my adult life since leaving my uncle's place. The thing that finally cracked my easy explanations wide open was a low door set into the farmhouse cellar wall. I had assumed those first few weeks led only to some forgotten root storage, of no real interest, to a busy caretaker with plenty else to manage each day out there. One evening, while hunting for a replacement fuse, I noticed the padlock on it looked newer than everything else in that cellar. Brushed steel set against hardware that otherwise looked to have hung there unchanged since the house's earliest working days back in the 1800s. Marjorie's paperwork had said nothing at all about a locked room anywhere on the property, and her contract had specifically stated that I held full access to every structure on site for the entire length of my 7-month stay out there that season. I told myself that checking behind that door counted less as trespassing and more as basic due diligence for a man alone on that ground who deserved to understand exactly what he was living beside for 7 long months of his own life that year. It took me most of an evening working with an old set of bolt cutters I found hanging in the equipment shed, but the padlock finally gave way beneath my patient, half-frozen fingers late that same night in the cellar. Behind it, I found a narrow room someone had clearly used as an archive rather than a cellar. Shelves of yellowed paperwork, older ledgers far more worn than the one I logged my own daily readings in, and a corkboard along the back wall covered edge to edge with photographs of men I did not recognize at all, standing in front of that same farmhouse. Most of the photographs carried a year written along the bottom edge in the same cramped handwriting, stretching back across the decades: 1941, 1958, 1973, 1992. Each name beneath each photograph followed by a short, handwritten notation in that same tight hand. In every single case, that notation read either left without notice or did not complete term. Phrases that felt, standing there in the cold and the dust of that small hidden room, far less reassuring than they had probably sounded to whoever first wrote them down years earlier, out on that same quiet ground. I did not mention the archive room to Marjorie during our next scheduled call, some instinct telling me she would only offer another calm, practiced explanation that would do nothing to actually settle the growing unease sitting heavy in my chest by then out there alone. I did tell her about the knocking of the kitchen window, describing it as carefully and as flatly as I could manage over the phone while she listened without interrupting me even once through the whole account that same evening. She was quiet for a beat longer than felt entirely natural before telling me that old farmhouses often shifted and groaned as the wind worked against the frame in ways that could seem almost deliberate to someone not yet used to hearing it out there at night. That explanation technically held together on its own terms, but it did nothing to explain why she then asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the attic lamp had been burning steadily every single night that week, a question she had never once asked me before on any of our earlier calls together since March. She would go on to ask me that exact same question, I noticed only much later, every single time I mentioned anything at all unusual for the remainder of my long season out on that quarter section, as though the answer mattered to her far more than she ever let on to me directly. There was another incident that same week I did not write about in the ledger at all, mostly because I could not think of a clinical enough way to describe it without sounding even to myself like a man whose isolation had finally started working on his own mind out there. I was checking fence line near the well house a little before dusk when I heard what sounded like several low voices murmuring together somewhere out past the fallow field. Too faint to make out clear words, but carrying a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of men praying together in a low, steady unison out in that empty stretch. I stood there with the fencing pliers still in hand, scanning the flat open ground for a long minute before telling myself it had been wind moving through the well house's cracked stonework that only sounded, for one bad moment, like human voices carrying together somewhere close by that field. I did not go looking to confirm it either way, and I did not mention it to Delbert Aching the next time I saw him in town. Some part of me already deciding that naming the fear out loud would only make it feel more real than it already did standing alone in that fallow field at dusk that evening. I drove into Wakini again near the end of that same week, mostly for fencing supplies and a fresh can of lamp oil, and I found myself asking Delbert more directly than I had before about whoever had worked the property just ahead of me on the rotation. The trust apparently kept running year after year out there. He set down the crate he was stocking behind the counter and studied me for a long moment before answering. The kind of look a person gives someone he is deciding whether to actually trust with something true, rather than something merely comfortable to say out loud. His name was Wendell Pruitt, Delbert told me finally, a quiet man from down near Collier who kept to himself the same way I apparently did, coming into town maybe once every couple of weeks for supplies, and never staying long enough for anyone to get to know him well at all that season. He finished his contract clean, Delbert said, which I understood even then to be an unusual enough detail that he felt the need to specify it out loud, as though most caretakers before him had not finished quite so cleanly on that same ground. When I asked whether Wendell had ever mentioned anything strange about the farm, anything about the bell or the lamp or a locked room in the cellar, Delbert's whole expression closed off right in front of me the same way it had that very first afternoon back in March. He told me plainly that he did not gossip about paying customers, current or former, and that if the trust wanted me to know more about the job than they had already told me, they would have told me themselves without needing his help with it. It was not an unkind answer, exactly, but it carried a weight that told me he already knew more than he was willing to say out loud to a stranger who might still be reporting back to the people who signed his invoices every single month of the year. I thanked him for the supplies and was almost out the door with the little bell above it jangling behind me when he called my name once quietly, from behind the counter still, in a voice pitched low enough that no one else in the store could have easily overheard him. He told me only to be careful about which doors I went looking behind out there, a warning vague enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough that I thought about it for the entire drive back out to the farm that afternoon. I spent longer than I probably should have that same evening working through the older ledgers stacked in the cellar archive room, comparing handwriting and dates from one battered volume to the next as the light outside slowly failed toward another long spring dusk out there. I found a pattern that unsettled me more with every page I turned. Entries growing steadily shorter and more clipped in the final weeks of nearly every caretaker's term, regardless of which decade I happened to be reading through at any given stretch that evening in that cold cellar. Careful daily notations about bell counts and lamp oil gradually gave way to fragmented lines about smells, about sounds, and about shapes glimpsed at the edge of the fallow field once full dark had settled over the quarter section each night. Then the entries simply stopped altogether, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes with entire weeks still remaining on what should have been a full 7-month term of employment for whoever had been keeping that particular volume up until then that same year. One ledger from the late 1950s ended on a page where the handwriting had grown so tight and cramped it was almost illegible even after I held it close under the lamp for a long, careful minute that same night. Its final entry read only "It remembers the digging," followed by nothing else at all. No signature and no closing note. Just several blank pages before the next volume's much neater hand began again the following spring. I sat with that ledger open on my lap until the light through the small cellar window had gone from pale gray to full dark. And when I finally checked my watch, I realized I had less than 10 minutes left to reach the attic before I had missed the earliest safe window for lighting that lamp. I ran the whole way up 2 flights of stairs with a fear in my chest. I could not fully explain to myself, my boots sliding once on the narrow steps before I finally reached the attic with barely a minute of true dusk left in the sky outside that window. I lit the lamp with hands that would not quite stop shaking, watching the small flame catch and steady behind the old glass the way it had every night since March, moving through the ritual that apparently every caretaker before me had once performed in that same narrow attic room. I did not sleep well that night, replaying the ledger's broken fragments over and over in my tired head until gray morning light finally crept through the farmhouse windows overlooking the yard below that whole quarter section. I woke determined to find real answers rather than continue guessing at whatever history the trust had gone to such careful trouble to keep entirely out of the contract I had originally signed back in Hutchinson that same March. I loaded the truck with enough fuel for the long round trip and drove into Wakini, the county seat large enough to still have a proper historical museum with any real archive worth searching through for a man in my position that week. The museum occupied the ground floor of a converted storefront 2 blocks off the courthouse square, its front windows crowded with old threshing photographs alongside a hand-lettered sign advertising a summer wheat harvest festival each year in that same small town. I sat outside in my truck for a full 5 minutes before finally going in, running through exactly what I planned to say to a stranger about ledgers and locked rooms and stocks bent in patterns I could not confidently explain to anyone still living in that county. In the end, I settled on telling the archivist only that I was researching the general history of a property I currently worked, which was true enough not to feel like an outright lie spoken right to her own face that morning. I was hoping someone in that small museum might recognize the name Halloran, a name I have found stamped into the spine of nearly every old ledger stacked on those cellar archive shelves back at the farm that same season. The archivist, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s named Pauline Ostrander, who had apparently spent most of her career cataloging farm and church records for half the small towns scattered across Gove County, recognized the family name almost immediately that same morning. She pulled a thin folder of yellowed newspaper clippings from a filing cabinet without needing to check any index first, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had handled that particular folder more than once before that same visit. She told me the Halloran operation had once employed one of the larger hired crews in that whole part of the county, right up until an incident at a relief well during the terrible drought of 1936 changed everything about how the family managed that property from then on. That collapse killed 7 hired men, Pauline told me, digging a new relief well beside the original when the ground beneath them gave way without warning during the worst stretch of that drought year, burying the whole crew under tons of dry Kansas earth before any rescue effort could reach them in time. The original well had somehow never run dry that entire drought while every other well in the county failed one after another, and Amos Halloran had ordered the second well dug specifically to relieve pressure on the first one. The surviving crew foreman would later describe that decision to a county inspector as coming from Amos himself, under circumstances nobody could fully explain afterward, not even the family that hired him. The official cause listed in every surviving county record was a simple ground collapse made fatal by unusually dry, unstable soil working against a poorly braced excavation, a straightforward explanation that satisfied the state inspector sent out from Topeka without much apparent difficulty at the time that summer. Pauline mentioned almost as an aside, while she sorted carefully through the rest of that same folder, that several surviving crew members interviewed by a downstate newspaper reporter in the weeks after the collapse gave accounts that never made it into that paper's final printed version at all that year. Those accounts describe sounds coming from the collapsed ground for nights afterward, a low, steady murmuring that search crews first mistook for men still calling out from somewhere beneath the fallen earth itself that same week. The family halted any further rescue effort less than 2 weeks after the collapse and had the original well sealed over completely on Amos Halloran's own orders. An unusually swift decision for a man who still, on paper at least, owed formal death benefits to 7 grieving families waiting on word from that same farmhouse. Pauline also found, tucked into the back of that same folder, a photocopy of a letter dated several months after the sealing, written by a physician the family had retained named Dr. Silas Enright. It was addressed to Amos Halloran directly and marked, even in photocopy, with a note reading confidential in faded ink that had bled slightly into the surrounding paper over the many decades since it was first written that year. The letter was strange enough that Pauline read part of it aloud to me herself, since she admitted she had never quite known what to make of it in all her years handling that particular collection of family records from the archive. It described what Enright called a persistent disturbance originating from the sealed well site, one he believed the family would be wiser to manage through nightly attendance and continuous small tribute rather than through any further attempt at clearing or abandoning the ground entirely that season. Before I left her archive that afternoon, Pauline pulled one further item from a separate drawer she said she rarely showed to anyone who came through asking questions about the Halloran family operation. It was a typed transcript of testimony given by one of the surviving crew foremen to a county coroner some 3 weeks after the collapse had finally been declared closed for good that same summer. The man's name was Orrin Castle, and his testimony described standing at the edge of the collapsed ground on the 4th night after the accident, listening alongside another crew member to a sound rising from beneath the earth that neither of them could bring himself to fully name in front of the coroner conducting that same hearing that week. He described it only as a kind of thirsty murmuring, low and patient and strangely calm given everything those 7 men must have suffered in their final minutes buried alive beneath that failed excavation during the worst drought the county had seen in more than a decade of records. Castle testified that the murmuring continued each night for 9 nights running before finally going quiet, and that he personally requested work off the Halloran payroll the following season rather than spend one more harvest anywhere within sight of that sealed well again in his life. The coroner's official report dismissed the testimony as understandable shock following a traumatic workplace disaster, a conclusion Pauline said she had always found a little too convenient given how carefully the family had otherwise documented every other detail surrounding that same collapse in their own private papers. She told me, folding the transcript carefully back into its sleeve before returning it to the drawer, that she had shown it to exactly 2 other researchers in nearly 30 years of running that archive. Both of them had asked her afterward, in roughly the same careful and hesitant tone I was using with her that same quiet afternoon, whether the Halloran family still owned that property out there at all. I did not tell her that the trust did or that I currently lived and worked on that same ground through the growing season of every year, some instinct telling me plainly that the less anyone else in Wakini knew about my own connection to Prairie Rest, the better it would be for everyone involved, herself included that day. I drove back west that same evening with the photocopied letter folded carefully in my jacket pocket beside the credit card statement. I still had not managed to pay down, arriving at the farm with barely enough daylight left to walk the long row before full dark settled in around me completely across that flat, open ground. As I approached the northern stretch near the well house, I noticed the spiral pattern from 3 weeks earlier had reappeared in a fresh section of wheat, this time crossing directly toward the farmhouse rather than curling in on itself the way that earlier patch had done that first time I found it. I lit the attic lamp that evening with Enright's letter still folded in my pocket, watching the small flame catch and steady, with a new and very specific dread settling deep into my chest as I climbed back down those narrow stairs afterward into the quiet house. I understood for the first time that the routine I had been performing every day without much real thought was not, as Marjorie had implied back in March, some outdated family superstition left over from an overcautious old farmer's paperwork from another century entirely. It was something closer to what Enright himself had called it in his own careful handwriting. A nightly proof of attendance offered to whatever still lingered beneath the ground where those 7 men once died, digging for water nearly a century earlier out on that same quarter section. I found myself wondering, standing alone in the gathering dark with the lamp finally catching its flame upstairs, what exactly happened to a caretaker who simply let that lamp go dark, even once during his own long season on that ground below it? I brought the letter to Marjorie during our next scheduled call and told her plainly that I needed real answers now rather than another vague reference to old buildings settling and overcautious family superstition left over from a farm that had operated under that same name for nearly a century and a half by then. After a long pause on the line, she finally admitted, in a clipped tone that suggested she had rehearsed the disclosure before for other caretakers standing exactly where I now stood, that the property carried what she called an unusual liability tied to the 1936 collapse. She said the standing agreement existed specifically to manage that liability rather than to prevent any conventional structural failure of the kind listed so plainly in my own original signed contract paperwork back in Hutchinson that same March. She would not elaborate much further beyond confirming that every caretaker before me had received that exact same limited explanation once circumstances eventually forced her own hand to finally offer it up to them as well that season. She reminded me, with what felt like genuine unease rather than simple corporate caution, that my contract still had 5.5 months remaining, and that leaving early would forfeit not only my second payment, but also whatever protection the completed ritual was apparently meant to provide a man in my position that year. 3 days later, Marjorie drove out to the farm herself, arriving with extra lamp oil and a case of supplies the trust wanted delivered to me in person rather than mailed the usual way through Averil's tiny post office window. She walked the long row with me that whole windy afternoon without once mentioning the ledger entries or the lamp readings the way she normally always did each week over the phone between us that season. Near the northern stretch, she finally stopped and stood quietly for a while, studying the spiral pattern I had already photographed and reported to her office days earlier, that same week, her hair whipping loose in the constant wind between us out there. I watched something pass across her face that looked, for the first time since I had known her at all, less like ordinary corporate caution and more like plain human guilt settling over her right there in that open field. I asked her outright how long she herself had actually known what the bell and the lamp truly protected against on that whole property, and she was quiet long enough that I genuinely thought she might not answer me at all that afternoon out there. She finally admitted she had taken this exact management job 11 years earlier under circumstances not entirely unlike my own. A sick parent and a mountain of medical debt and a listing that had seemed, at the time, like the answer to a prayer she had stopped believing anyone would actually answer for her. Before she left that evening, she pressed an envelope into my hand containing an extra $1,500 in cash. Money she said was not on any invoice and would never appear on any tax document the trust filed with the state of Kansas that year. She told me to consider it hazard pay from one person who understood exactly what the job truly cost to another, who was still out there paying that same cost in real time, entirely alone on that ground. I nearly left that same week anyway, sitting up one night with a bag half packed and the truck fueled and ready outside the equipment shed, doing the math again on debts I still owed and a mother whose care I could not afford to interrupt even for a single month while I figured out something safer to do with my own life instead. I understood, with a bitterness I still carry with me even now, that $56,000 represented the difference between finally climbing out of the hole my mother's care had dug for me, or sinking further into it completely alone with no one left to call for help out there. Whatever lingered beneath that sealed well, I had already survived weeks of small wrongness against it, and could likely survive 5.5 more months if I simply refused to let the bell or the lamp ever fail under my watch again that season. I unpacked that bag before dawn, ashamed of how close I had actually come to running from a job I had promised to finish, and I recommitted myself to the standing agreement with the rigor that bordered on total obsession from that morning forward. I checked the lamp's fuel level twice through every single night instead of only once before bed, and I set 3 separate alarms on my phone every single afternoon to make absolutely certain I never again came within even a few minutes of missing that dusk lighting up in the attic window. I began counting the bell strikes out loud each morning as well, some part of me deciding that a ritual performed in total silence carried less weight than one spoken plainly into the dark before dawn across that whole open quarter section. The death storm that rolled in during the middle of May answered, far more thoroughly than I ever wanted it, answered the question I had been quietly turning over since that first conversation with Marjorie out on the long row earlier that same month. The forecast on my phone that morning had called for gusts up to 40 miles an hour, manageable enough by the standards I had already grown used to on that particular stretch of open ground over the past several weeks of steady spring wind. The wall of dust rolled in from the southwest instead far earlier than predicted, and by early afternoon visibility had dropped so low that I lost sight of the equipment shed entirely from the farmhouse porch, where I stood watching it come across the fields toward me. It was a wall so complete that it felt far less like ordinary weather than like the ground itself had slowly decided to close its own dry fist around the entire quarter section for the whole remainder of that long afternoon out there. The generator nearly failed a little after 4 that same afternoon, choking on dust pulled in through the intake filter hard enough to stall the engine before I finally got it cleared enough to run properly again under those conditions that day. It was a problem I'd already handled once before without much real trouble, except that the effort of clearing it cost me nearly 20 minutes. I had not planned on losing with dusk already closing in fast across the whole quarter section that day. I bundled a bandana over my face and forced myself out into the storm toward the farmhouse stairs, following a length of rope I had tied weeks earlier between the porch rail and the back door for exactly this kind of emergency situation out there. The wind out there carried something beneath its own roar that I could not make myself believe was only weather, a low murmuring rising and falling in a pattern too close to voices praying together for my comfort inside that storm. It was close enough that I found myself checking back over my own shoulder every few steps despite seeing nothing at all beyond 3 feet of driving dust in every direction around me the whole time I fought toward that back door. I made it up the 2 flights of stairs with my lungs burning and my eyes streaming, my hands already going numb from the effort of gripping that rope tight the whole way across the dark yard in that wind. The lamp's wick had gone dry from the dust working its way in through a gap in the old attic window frame, and I crouched there working the striker again and again while the murmuring beyond the walls grew steadily louder. It was joined eventually by something that was not murmuring at all, but closer to a low, patient scraping wood against stone, somewhere out past the fallow field. I could no longer see through that storm. For one instant, a gap opened in the driving dust, just long enough for me to see something pale, moving low along the fence line near the well house, closer to the farmhouse than the scraping sound had any right to be that particular evening in that wall of dirt. It was not upright, and it was not on all fours either, moving instead in some low, jointed way that reminded me uncomfortably of several men crouched together and moving as a single body. If several men could somehow move that low and that fast across open ground in a storm that thick and blinding. The gap in the dust closed again almost as quickly as it had opened, and the lamp finally caught in that same instant. The flame steadying just as whatever I had seen dropped back out of sight beyond the edge of what I could make out through that storm. I checked my watch once the flame finally held steady and saw I had perhaps 4 minutes of true dusk left before full dark settled over the quarter section, and I made it back downstairs just as the last gray light finally failed completely somewhere behind that wall of driving dust outside the farmhouse windows. The scraping sound stopped almost immediately once the lamp was burning steadily again, cutting off with an abruptness that felt far more like intention than simple coincidence, leaving only the wind and my own ragged breathing filling the sudden quiet inside that small kitchen. I logged that entry in the ledger with a hand I could barely make legible, describing the generator trouble and the delayed lamp and the sounds I had heard in language as clinical as I could possibly manage under the circumstances I had just lived through out there. I noted at the bottom of the page the exact number of minutes the lamp had stayed dark. 11. A detail that felt strangely important, even though I could not have said exactly why at the time I wrote it down that night. 2 days later, once the storm had cleared enough for the cell signal to hold steady again, Marjorie called and asked me, in a voice with an edge to it I had never once heard from her before that call, to confirm that specific number a second time, before she would let the conversation move on to anything else at all that morning. The days that followed the storm carried a different quality of fear than anything I had felt before it. A fear grounded now in physical evidence, rather than half-glimpsed shapes and half-heard sounds carried on the wind during a single bad afternoon out there alone. I found myself walking the long row each morning studying the ground near the well house for signs of whatever exactly had been scraping at the stone during those 11 minutes the lamp had stood completely dark against that storm. I found fresh gouges cut into the weathered wood of the well house door, 4 or 5 parallel grooves, each roughly the width of a finger, but far too deep and far too evenly spaced to have come from any tool or claw I recognized from a lifetime spent working with my hands around farm equipment and livestock. I photographed the gouges and reported them to Marjorie that same afternoon, and I noticed something new in her voice on that call. A strain that told me she was no longer entirely certain the ritual alone would be enough to see me safely through the remainder of my long season out on that ground. I drove into Wakini once more that same week, mostly to buy a box of shells for my uncle's old rifle, and a length of heavy chain I intended to run through the farmhouse door handles each night after dark. It was a precaution that felt almost embarrassing to explain to myself even as I loaded it all into the truck bed outside Delbert's own hardware store that same windy afternoon in early July that year. Delbert rang up the purchase without much comment, though he added a spare battery lantern to the counter unprompted and told me it was on the house this time, a small kindness that meant more to me standing there than the $18 it would have otherwise cost me that week. He told me, as I carried the last bag out to the truck, that Wendell Pruitt had bought the exact same length of chain from him the season before mine, in nearly the exact same week of that same growing year, and that he had wondered even then whether he should have said more to him before he drove back out to that same farm afterward. I asked him directly what he thought I should do differently than Wendell apparently had, and he was quiet for a long moment before telling me only to keep that lamp burning no matter what. Every single night, no matter how tired or how frightened it made me feel standing out there alone on that porch after dark. He added, almost as an afterthought while I climbed back into the truck that afternoon, that his own grandfather had worked a single season on the Halloran crew back before the collapse ever happened at all. He had never once talked about those years afterward except to say that some ground simply remembers what gets taken from it and does not much care how long a person waits before finally paying it back in full. Certain nights from the weeks that followed still stand out clearly to me even now, more so than the general blur of dust and grinding vigilance that swallowed most of that long May and the June that came after it without much mercy shown to me out there. There was the night in late May when I woke to find every window on the farmhouse's north side fogged over from the inside with a thin gray film, and pressed into that film on the glass facing the well house was the clear shape of a hand. The fingers were splayed wide across the cold glass, far larger than any human hand I had ever once shaken in my own life before that long, strange growing season began for me out there on that ground. There was the night in early June when I came upstairs to light the lamp at dusk and found the wick already burning steadily with a flame I had not lit myself and could not explain through any oil or fuel trouble I later checked twice over that same evening in that quiet attic room. I stood staring at that small flame for a long while before finally deciding I would rather have it burning through some means I did not understand than dark through any means I understood all too well by then out there. There was the longer, worse stretch in late June when I woke 3 mornings running to find every single one of the 11 fieldstones along the long row turned to face inward toward the farmhouse rather than outward along the boundary the way I had always found them myself back in April. I turned each stone back to its correct facing again each of those 3 mornings, my hands steady only because I had stopped allowing myself the luxury of shaking by then, some cold and practical part of me having simply taken over where the fear used to sit inside my chest. I never once let myself fully rest during that entire stretch, so that I would never once fail to hear the small alarm I had rigged from an old kitchen timer wired to a battery, set every single evening without fail to warn me a full hour before the light began to fail across that ridge of open wheat ground. I made every single lighting during those grinding weeks. Every one, moving up those narrow stairs through heat and dust and bitter wind, even on the night in early July when my hands were bleeding badly from a fall against a piece of equipment near the shed earlier that same day. Every part of me wanted nothing more than to collapse inside that farmhouse and let just one dusk pass without the ritual finally completed. But by then I understood something no contract clause or family letter could have ever fully taught a man in my position that season. I understood exactly what waited so patiently beneath that sealed well on the other side of a mist lighting, and I was simply not willing to find that particular thing out for myself firsthand, not ever again after that storm in May. There was one further night from that stretch I have never once written down or spoken aloud to anyone, not even Renata during our longest phone calls that following autumn, when she pressed me harder than usual about what had actually happened out there across those 7 months of my life. I woke sometime past 2 in the morning to the sound of my own name spoken once, low and flat and strangely toneless, carrying up through the farmhouse floorboards from somewhere in the kitchen below where no living person had any business standing at that particular hour of the night. I lay perfectly still for a long while, listening to my own pulse and telling myself it had been a dream, or the wind finding some new gap in the old frame that only sounded, for one bad moment, like a voice shaping the two syllables of my own name out there in the dark house below me. When I finally worked up the nerve to look down the stairwell, I saw nothing at all beyond the kitchen, exactly as I had left it hours earlier. The ledger closed on the table, and the chain still looped through both door handles the way I had left it every single night since that trip to Wakini for supplies. I did not go downstairs to check any further that night, choosing instead to lie still and listen. And I did not log the incident the following morning the way the standing agreement technically required of me. Some part of me decided that certain things were better carried alone than written down in a ledger some future caretaker might eventually read, the way I had read all the ones that came before mine. I thought about Enright's line concerning familiarity, about a presence that learned a caretaker's own rhythm the longer he stayed alone on that ground without relief from another living soul nearby him. I understood, lying awake until the gray light of morning finally reached my small window, that it had learned mine considerably faster than I had wanted to believe possible, that early in my own long contract there. The worst of those certain nights came in mid-July, roughly 3 weeks before the incident with the turned fieldstones, when something struck the farmhouse's back door hard enough that I felt the impact through the floorboards under my bare feet before I ever heard the sound of it land against that old wood. I grabbed my uncle's rifle, more out of instinct than any real belief it would do much good against whatever waited out there. And I stood in the dark kitchen, listening to a slow, deliberate scraping move along the porch boards from one end to the other and back again, without pause, across that whole width. It stopped directly outside the door for what felt like a full minute, long enough that I could hear something that might have been breathing, if breathing could sound that wet and that uneven, coming through the old wood, only inches from where I stood frozen with the barrel raised and my finger resting light against the guard. I did not open that door, and did not look through the window beside it, choosing instead to back slowly toward the stairs while keeping the barrel pointed at the entrance, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my own throat, standing there in that dark kitchen alone. Whatever it was eventually moved off the porch and out into the yard, its retreating steps growing fainter and less deliberate the farther they traveled from the farmhouse, until the ordinary sounds of wind and settling dust finally swallowed them completely. Sometime before dawn arrived that morning, I found a single mark in the dry ground near the bottom porch step the next morning. Not quite a footprint and not quite a handprint either, pressed deep enough into the packed earth that whatever left it had to weigh considerably more than any one man standing alone out there that night. During one of my walks along the long row in late July, taking a slightly wider path than usual, after a hard rain had softened the ground enough to make walking easier off the worn trail near the well house, I found a weathered fence post half buried in the buffalo grass, well outside the marked boundary line I normally kept to each day out there. Carved into the wood, worn nearly smooth by decades of weather but still legible enough to trace with a bare finger, was a single set of initials with no name beneath them and no date carved anywhere else on that same post to identify who exactly they belonged to across all those years. I thought immediately of the archive room's photographs and their short-clipped notations, and I stood over that weathered post for a long time in the wind, wondering how many other quiet markers like it might be scattered across those 640 acres of trust land surrounding that farmhouse. I did not dig, and I did not disturb the ground around it any further than my own boots already had crossing that stretch of softened earth, choosing instead to photograph the post carefully before continuing the rest of my loop in a silence that had nothing at all to do with the wind picking up along that ridge that particular morning. It was during the same grim, careful stretch of routine that I finally found the thing that explained everything, tucked inside a loose stone in the cellar wall behind where the old archive shelf stood against the farmhouse's original foundation on that same lowest level. I only discovered it because one of the old ledgers I had returned to its place sat slightly crooked, and when I reached to straighten it, my fingers caught the edge of a seam in the stonework that did not belong there at all among the surrounding masonry. Behind that stone I found a single leather-bound diary far older than anything else in the room. Its cover cracked and gone soft with age from decades of careful handling by whoever had hidden it there originally against discovery by anyone else in that family. Inside, in handwriting I matched after some careful study to a signature reading Ada Halloran on the inside cover, was a detailed and increasingly desperate account of the years she had spent quietly living beside what she referred to throughout only as the thirst below the well. She never once used any more specific name for it, as though naming the thing more precisely carried its own particular kind of risk she was unwilling to take even in a private diary meant for no other eyes but her own to ever read out there. Ada's account, once I worked through her cramped and often water-damaged handwriting over the following several evenings, laid out a history far stranger and darker than the bare facts Pauline Ostrander had already shown me back in Waukene weeks earlier at that small museum. It described how the 7 men trapped by the 1936 collapse had, according to sounds the rescue crews documented before the effort was fully called off, remained alive and audible for at least 9 full days after the ground finally gave way around them completely that terrible summer. They called out in a rhythm that 2 of the surviving crew members, both former foremen by trade, had come to recognize as something closer to a shared murmuring than any ordinary human cry for help from trapped and dying men beneath that failed excavation. Ada's notes described what came after only in careful fragments, mentioning a sensitivity to moisture and to attention, a hunger that stopped resembling any ordinary human need at all, and a growing tendency to move and speak as a single body rather than as 7 separate and distinct men any longer beneath that ground. It began, in Ada's own unsettling phrase, to resemble a thirst slowly gathering itself around a single shared and endlessly patient hope that had not existed in any one of those men before the earth took them from each other and from themselves that summer. Amos Halloran's decision to seal the original well a second time had come only after 2 separate crews sent to reopen it for water refused to return to that section of the property at all, citing sounds and sights none of them would fully describe even under direct order from Amos himself that same year. Ada's diary made painfully clear that the family understood, even then, that whatever now lingered where those 7 men once died together was no longer simply 7 hired hands who had perished together in a single terrible collapse on a single terrible day that drought summer. It had become something that gathered itself slowly and with terrible patience out of their shared thirst into a single distributed presence able to sense water and attention and human warmth from a considerable distance across that whole quarter section. Ada estimated its effective range based on incidents documented over the following several decades since the collapse at no less than half a mile in every given direction from the sealed well itself out there. The 2 later abandonment attempts Ada referenced in her diary had each ended, her account explained in grim and unflinching detail, with grave losses at the structures nearest the sealed well that she described only in her own careful language throughout that account. In the first instance, that phrase in the fuller telling meant the deaths of 2 hired men stationed at a nearby line shack sometime in 1944, found by a relief crew in a state Ada refused to describe any further than that single terse sentence in her own private diary that page. In the second instance, it meant the complete disappearance without any trace at all of a young couple who had briefly attempted to homestead a cleared section of that same property sometime back in the early 1960s before the trust bought them out entirely. That couple had been entirely unaware of what actually lingered on the ground they had so hopefully chosen to build a small house upon that particular spring, years before Marjorie Voss or I ever set foot on that same quarter section ourselves. Ada's eventual conclusion arrived that only after those 2 disasters and reluctantly accepted by a family more concerned with keeping the farm together than genuine understanding of what they were actually managing beneath it was that the thirst could not simply be starved into dormancy through silence and permanent abandonment of the ground. Silence and total neglect seemed only to make it more desperate and correspondingly far more dangerous to anyone still living or working nearby it on that particular stretch of ground above Waukene. One passage near the middle of the diary stayed with me more than any other, written in a steadier hand than the shaking entries near the end, and I copied it out onto a loose page of my own, so I would not have to keep reopening the fragile old book itself each time I wanted to reread it that summer. It is not memory in the way we mean the word among the living, Ada had written, but it keeps a reckoning all the same, and it appears to want nothing more complicated in the end than to be attended by whoever stands watch above it on any given night of the year. I've come to believe, she continued, that the lamp means less as illumination than as proof someone still remembers what is owed, a debt Amos earned the day he chose a second ceiling over further listening to men who were, whatever else they had become, still calling out from the earth below that well. I read that particular passage 3 or 4 separate times over the following weeks, usually late at night with the kitchen lamp turned down low beside the ledger, and each time it left me with that exact same uneasy question sitting heavy in my chest out there. I never managed to answer it for myself before my own contract finally ended, whether ringing that bell and lighting that lamp each day made me a true caretaker, or only the latest man paying down a debt none of us had ever actually agreed to owe in the first place that season. Ada's diary made clear the thirst could instead be managed indefinitely through a controlled routine of attendance and small tribute, which it seemed to interpret as a kind of company it was willing to accept in place of the true release from that ground it could presumably never actually receive on its own terms. That routine was combined with a fixed, reliable morning signal sent out through the bell's full 40 strikes each day. Account Ada's notes suggested the thirst had slowly come to recognize as proof. It was proof, Ada firmly believed, that its watch remained deliberate and attended rather than accidental and quietly abandoned the way it had been left twice before in the decades following that same collapse. It was a distinction that seemed to matter to it in ways Ada herself admitted she could not fully explain, even after years spent carefully observing the pattern from a cautious and respectful distance on that same quarter section. The final pages of Ada's diary, written in a hand grown shaky with what I assumed at first was simply old age, finally catching up with her, contained her last and most troubling observation of the entire account she had kept hidden behind that loose stone for so many years of her own life on that farm. It explained why the family had settled on a rotation of hired caretakers rather than assigning any one person permanently to the role for the remainder of their entire working life out there on that whole quarter section above the sealed well. Ada had originally recommended the rotation herself out of simple humanitarian concern for the psychological toll the isolated work clearly took on any one man left alone out there too long at a single stretch without real relief from another living soul nearby him. Then she began noticing a pattern she carefully documented across several consecutive caretakers through the 1940s and into the 1950s, one that troubled her more than anything she had written before it in that same diary. The thirst appeared to grow steadily more attuned to any single caretaker's specific rhythm and daily presence the longer that person remained alone on site, without any real relief from another living soul nearby him during a season. It grew correspondingly more capable of anticipating exactly when the lamp would be lit and exactly when the bell would ring each and every single day of that particular caretaker's long contract there on that same ground. It also grew more willing, Ada wrote, to test the boundaries of the whole arrangement in the weeks following any extended stretch of that familiarity between the ground and the man watching over it through the long growing season each year. That testing took the form in at least 3 documented cases before the family finally instituted a hard 7-month rotation limit of increasingly bold incursions past the marked boundary during a caretaker's final weeks on site before his contract came to its scheduled end that same season. In every one of those 3 cases, the incursions ended with the caretaker resigning abruptly with no real explanation. Or in one case Ada described only in a terse and heavily crossed-out line near the very bottom of that page, not resigning at all. I closed the diary that night with my hands still not quite steady, finally understanding why every single ledger in that archive room ended the exact same way it always did. Page after page after page of careful daily notations trailing off into fear across nearly a century of caretakers who had come before me on that same ground. I understood why Marjorie had always asked almost reflexively whether the lamp had been burning properly every single time I mentioned anything even slightly unusual during our long weekly calls together across that whole season out there. I understood, with a dread that settled deep into my chest and did not fully leave for the remainder of my contract, that I had roughly 9 weeks left before reaching the point in the rotation where Ada's documented pattern of increasingly bold incursions had historically begun to appear in every previous caretaker's own account of that same farm. 9 weeks during which I would need to maintain perfect, unbroken discipline with the bell and the lamp if I hoped to reach the 3rd week of October with my contract, my sanity, and my own life all still fully intact and unbroken by whatever waited beneath that ground. Those 9 weeks passed in a blur of grim, exhausting vigilance that I do not fully remember now in individual detail, so much as in a general impression of heat and dust and relentless daily routine that never once let up on me for even a single morning or evening across that whole stretch. I made every single bell ringing during that final stretch, every one, holding the count steady through wind and heat and one bitter week in early September when the temperature never once dropped below 90 through 6 straight days running out there. I never let myself fully rest through any of it, checking the lamp's oil level every 2 hours through the night by an alarm I had rigged from the same old kitchen timer, refusing to trust my own tired judgment about when the fuel had truly burned low enough to need refilling again that season. There were nights during that stretch when I heard the murmuring return beyond the well house, always faint, always just at the edge of what I could clearly make out, and I learned to work through it without stopping, ringing the count out loud until the bell fell silent again against whatever waited out there, listening to me. There was one evening in late September when I found 3 of the 11 field stones scraped clean of their old markings, the bare rock beneath showing fresh and pale against the older weathered stones surrounding each one. And I recut every marking before dusk with hands I forced to stay steady through sheer will alone that day. I understood by then exactly what waited on the other side of a single missed lighting, and I was simply not willing to find that particular thing out for myself firsthand, not after everything Ada's diary and my own eyes had already shown me across that long, grinding season on that ground. Marjorie called on the final Sunday of my contract, the 3rd week of October, to confirm the arrangements for closing out the property before that long growing season officially ended for good that particular year out there on the quarter section. A truck and a small crew were coming out the following Wednesday to help me pack out and begin the handoff process for whichever caretaker the trust had already lined up to replace me on that same rotation for the coming year. She mentioned that particular detail so casually, as though it were the single most unremarkable thing in the entire world, that it took me a long moment to fully register exactly what she had just said to me over that same phone line. A replacement was already hired, already briefed, already scheduled to arrive at Prairie Rest less than a week after I finally left it behind for good. As though the position I had spent 7 brutal months surviving was simply a seat that could never sit empty for even a single day of the year. I asked her, more sharply than I probably should have given how much I still wanted that final payment to clear without any complication on the trust's end, whether the new caretaker truly understood what he was actually agreeing to take on out there. Marjorie's answer came back careful and practiced in a way that told me she had given some version of it many times before to many previous caretakers standing exactly where I now stood on that same porch. Every caretaker received precisely the information he needed at precisely the moment he was ready to receive it, she said. An answer that told me everything about how the trust had managed to keep this whole arrangement running quietly for well over a century, without a single word of it ever reaching a newspaper or a courtroom in Kansas. The crew arrived that Wednesday morning exactly as promised, and I spent the whole day walking a stranger from the trust staff through the bell, the long row, and the lamp one final time before my own long contract officially came to its close out on that ground. I described the ritual in the same flat, careful language Marjorie had used with me 7 long months earlier, watching his eyes glaze slightly at what he clearly assumed was standard overcautious family tradition, rather than anything genuinely worth taking seriously out on that quarter section. I found myself wanting more than once that entire afternoon to grab him by the jacket and tell him absolutely everything I knew. The stalks, the murmuring, the scraping I had heard during that dust storm in May. Ada's old diary still hidden in my duffel bag beneath the change of clothes I had not yet unpacked from my truck. Every single time the words rose in my throat, I thought of the $56,000 still owed to me. Half of it already spent clearing the credit card balance, and most of a month's worth of my mother's care from the year before that same season. I said nothing beyond what the official handoff required of me, telling myself that a full-grown man, reading a contract with his own eyes wide open, deserved the same chance to make his own choices that I had once made with mine back in March. I left that farm the following morning with the second half of my payment already confirmed sitting in my bank account, and Ada's old diary zipped carefully away into the bottom of my duffel bag beside a stack of photographs I had taken of the archive room, before locking that stone panel shut behind me one final time. I drove east through Waukene and then on toward Hutchinson with the windows cracked despite the heat, needing the sound of moving air to fill a silence that felt, after 7 full months out there, almost unbearably loud in its own strange way inside that cab. I told myself, somewhere past Great Bend, that I was finished with Prairie Rest for good, that I would deposit the money, pay off what remained of my debts, and never think about that quarter section again if I could possibly help it for the rest of my life. For a while, through that autumn and on into the following winter, that plan mostly held together, though I noticed I had developed a habit I could not quite shake of leaving at least one lamp burning somewhere in my apartment every single night without exception. It was a small, persistent unease that never fully resolved itself, no matter how many months slowly passed or how very far I physically moved away from that particular quarter section above Waukene that whole year. Benada noticed the change in me before I ever admitted it to her directly, calling most Sundays that winter to ask careful, roundabout questions about how the season had actually gone out there for me, month after long month alone. I answered her mostly with half-truths about the heat and the long hours and a difficult but ultimately harmless employer who paid me very well indeed for my continued silence about all of it that whole year. I told her the money had cleared the credit card in most of a month's worth of our mother's care, which was true, and that I felt more like myself again than I had in years, which was not quite true, but close enough that I could say it without my voice giving anything away over the phone between us. She asked once, toward the end of January, why I still kept a small lamp burning in the hallway every single night even after she had gone to bed during a weekend visit. A habit she had noticed and mentioned only once before letting it drop entirely between us that week. I told her it was just an old habit from working alone out there, nothing more than that, and she accepted the answer the way she had accepted most of my answers since our father passed, gently and without much real conviction behind her own nodding that evening. Then, in the second week of the following April, almost exactly 1 year after that first listing had landed in front of me at my kitchen table in Hutchinson, Marjorie Voss called my cell phone directly for the first time since my contract had ended the previous October. Her voice sounded tight in a way that told me, before she had even said one single word to me, that something out on that quarter section had gone badly wrong once again. Somehow, already, less than 6 months after I had finally driven away from it for good. She asked without much preamble whether I would consider returning to Prairie Rest on an emergency basis, since the caretaker who replaced me had stopped responding to the trust's weekly check-in calls 3 full days earlier that same week. The remote camera mounted near the equipment shed showed the attic window dark for 2 consecutive nights running, and a sound sensor installed some time after my own contract had ended had recorded no bell ringing at all for nearly 18 hours straight by the time she finally called me that morning. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear for a long moment, looking out my apartment window at a gray Hutchinson afternoon that felt 1,000 miles removed from that quarter section and everything sealed beneath the ground out there. I found myself doing the math on debts I no longer owed, and a life I had only just begun, quietly rebuilding for myself. And somewhere underneath all of that careful arithmetic, I felt the old cold certainty settle back into my chest exactly the way it had that first season. I understood that whatever still lingered beneath that well now knew my particular rhythm better than anyone else alive, and that some part of me had known, from the moment I first drove away the previous October, that the ground was never really finished with me at all. Not truly. I told Marjorie I needed until morning to decide, and she agreed, though the strain in her voice made clear she did not really think morning would change much of anything about the situation waiting for me out there. I did not sleep that night either, sitting instead at my kitchen table with Ada's diary open in front of me to the passage about attendance, reading it again by the light of the one lamp I now kept burning in every room without exception, the way I had so many nights that long season on the farm. I thought about Wendell Pruitt, whose contract had ended clean, according to Delbert Aiken, and about the caretaker after him, whose bell had gone silent and whose lamp had gone dark while I sat safe in an apartment nearly 200 miles away from all of it that whole winter. I thought about the weathered fence post beneath the buffalo grass near the long row, and about the $1,500 in cash still folded inside an envelope in my dresser drawer, money I had never quite been able to bring myself to spend on anything as ordinary as groceries or rent that whole year. By the time the sun finally came up over the parking lot outside my window, I had already packed a bag I told myself was only for driving out to briefly assess things. Though some part of me that had spent 7 months ringing a bell each morning already understood there was very little left to actually assess out there. I called Marjorie back a little after 7 that morning and told her I would drive out, though I did not ask her this time to send anyone else along with me the way I might have a year earlier before I understood exactly what the job actually required of a man standing alone on that ground. She offered to arrange for someone from the trust staff to meet me there regardless, and I told her honestly that I thought it would be better if I went in first alone, the way I had learned that ground and its particular patience the first time around, without anyone standing beside me to second-guess what I already knew about it. She was quiet on the line for a moment before agreeing, though she made me promise to call the moment I reached the property, a promise I gave easily enough without yet knowing how difficult it might become to actually keep it once I finally got there myself. I spent the drive west out of Hutchinson running through everything I still remembered from Ada's diary, the bell, the lamp, the attendants, turning each detail over in my mind the way I once turned tolerances on a stamping die under my own careful hands back before any of this began for me. I checked every single piece of it against a memory I had learned the hard way not to trust to feeling alone anymore, not after everything that quarter section had already taught me across one long grinding season of my own life out there. Somewhere past Great Bend, the radio lost its last clear station, and I drove the remaining miles in a silence broken only by tires humming against dry pavement and, once, the sound of my own voice saying Marjorie's name aloud just to hear something other than my own thoughts filling that cab. I reached the turnoff for the farm lane a little before 4 o'clock that same afternoon, the light already slanting low and gold across the wheat stubble, the way it always seemed to that time of year on that particular stretch of ground above Wakini. I felt something tighten hard in my chest at the very first sight of the yard opening up beyond the last stand of cedar windbreak, the bell post still standing exactly where I had left it the previous October, silent now and streaked with rust against the failing afternoon light. The replacement caretaker's truck sat parked at an angle near the equipment shed, driver's door still hanging wide open, and there were no footprints at all leading away from it anywhere in the dry, packed dirt that surrounded that whole section of yard around the farmhouse. There was only a single set of tracks circling the vehicle twice before ending abruptly near the farmhouse steps, as though whoever made them had simply stopped partway through their own third slow loop around that truck, without ever finishing it out there. I called out his name, a name Marjorie had given me over the phone that morning. Curtis. Twice into that silent yard, and I got nothing back at all beyond the sound of wind moving steady and low across the whole quarter section surrounding that farmhouse. I checked the kitchen first, moving quickly without needing to talk myself through it, and found the ledger sitting open on the table to a final entry written in a hand far less steady than my own had ever been even during that dust storm the previous May out there. It read only 3 words, "It knows me now," followed by nothing else at all, no signature and no closing note, the pen itself still lying where it had apparently rolled off the table sometime after whoever wrote that final line had stopped writing anything more that same day. I found no sign of Curtis anywhere in the farmhouse, the cellar, or the barn standing at the edge of the yard, and I did not go looking beyond the marked boundary of the long row itself that same evening. Some old and hard-learned instinct told me plainly that whatever had happened to him had already happened well before I had ever arrived out there, that particular afternoon in the fading western light. I checked my watch and saw I had perhaps 18 minutes of true daylight left before that whole quarter section finally went dark around the silent yard surrounding the farmhouse and the equipment shed. I understood, standing there in the wind with an empty truck and an open door and no man anywhere to be found, exactly what needed doing next regardless of anything else still unresolved that evening. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs to the attic with hands that remembered the motion far better than my own conscious mind did, the striker catching on the second attempt the way it always had for me across that whole long season the year before. I watched the small flame catch and steady against the old glass, counting the bell strikes I still owed for that same missed morning under my breath, as I came back downstairs, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 40, until the whole yard stood answered again by that same small, stubborn light against the coming night. When the last strike finally faded into the evening air, the whole quarter section went quiet in that same unbearable way I remembered from the dust storm the year before. No wind, no murmuring, Nothing at all before the ordinary sounds of evening slowly returned around me in that yard. I did not call Marjorie that night the way I had promised her I would, choosing instead to sit through the full dark hours in that kitchen with the lamp burning steadily above me and the rifle within easy reach, listening to a silence I understood now better than I understood almost anything else left in my own life. I never found Curtis, not that night and not in the days that followed once a proper search crew finally made it out that county road behind me, and the trust closed the file on him quietly, the same practiced way I imagined it had closed every file, like it going back over a century on that same ground. I stayed on through that whole second season without ever fully deciding to. Some part of me understanding that a debt does not simply end because the man who first agreed to pay it wants very badly for it to be finished with him. I still keep a lamp burning in every room of wherever I happen to be living now, and some evenings, right around the hour the light finally starts to fail outside my window, I find myself standing very still and listening for a sound I both hope and dread. I will never hear again in this life. I think sometimes about Ada's line, that it is not memory in the way we mean the word among the living, but that it keeps a reckoning all the same, and I have come to understand, more than I ever wanted to, exactly what it means to be reckoned for.